Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Just Two Dads with my co-host and colleague Shawn Francis. I'm Brian Altunian, and today it's Just Two Dads talking about the impacts of the big, beautiful bill, as it's been called, which I frankly don't quite understand. But we're going to talk about it and its impact on our community and on a much larger scale. So stay tuned for another episode of Just Two Dads. It's going to be Just Two Dads. No guests today. We're going to get into a deep discussion about the impact of current legislation. Hello and welcome again to Just Two Dads. We are in episode number 211, so a little over 200 episodes that we've been doing for 4 years. Shawn and I generally have been had guests on our podcast in order to get into details and shine a spotlight on those people who are serving the special needs community. Today, we decided to forego a guest so we could have a conversation between the two of us on the impact of current legislation at the federal level and state level and its impact on our community. So without further ado, I usually, when we end the episodes, one of the things that I say is empathy and love is more important now than almost ever. And it's out of that empathy and love that we're having this discussion today. It's out of empathy and love that we haven't had this discussion prior to today. And so we're looking forward to a lively conversation. Shawn and I have been colleagues for over 10 years in our financial services business, and we have been co-hosts and partners in this initiative serving the special needs communities for about 5 years. And we are aligned on a lot of things, and there's some things that we don't agree with each other, and that's okay. That's what makes the human condition what it is. So, today we're going to have a conversation. So we welcome comments when you view the episode. We're not doing this live; we're recording, and we'll be posting this on all the places where we have our episodes. So let's just get into the conversation. Shawn, how you feeling today? You good? Ready to go?
Adventurous. The truth of the matter is, this is, I think, and this isn't hyperbole. This isn't meant to hype the episode up or anything like that. But I think it's probably the most bold episode that we've done. The most, because it's a raw, difficult topic to speak about on several levels, because we're not just going to just jump into talking about the bill. Truth of the matter is, Brian talks about things that we agree upon. There's more things that we agree upon than things that we don't. And one of the things that I don't know if it's one of the things that I think actually challenged our relationship in good ways is that with the many things that we agree upon and the things that are important to us, they happen to align from a political standpoint. And we also, and that changed this past election. And when it did, we talked about how much conversation do we have about that. We had conversations amongst ourselves. And then the other thing is, do we want to get into, revealing where we stand politically? And the truth of the matter is, just pure, transparency. I did not vote for Donald Trump. Brian did, and he didn't just vote for him. He had not voted that way, in that direction ever in his life. So while we didn't necessarily talk about it, I think that was an adjustment for him. I'm not speaking for him. I think that, just observing, when you go in a different direction somewhat, you're kind of like, one of several things takes place. Well, this is how I feel, this is the direction I'm going in, and that's it. And I don't care what anybody else thinks. I think there's a certain amount of that took place because he was comfortable with his choice. But I also, and I didn't tell you this, I didn't worry for you that somebody's going to come kill you for making that choice, but I worried about you being maligned for that choice. And then I had to think to myself too, gosh, did I lose a part of a family member? I never thought he would vote that way. And then we had conversations about, well, what is it that made you vote that way? Now, that's not what we're talking about here today, but
I think we should. Listen, you're bringing it up and you're, rather than ask me directly, you're sort of hypothesizing here for an audience. But we'd have the conversation.
Go ahead. Go ahead then. Go ahead then. Yeah.
Really matter. I had voted and registered Democrat my entire life until this past election, and there were a number of reasons why I changed my party affiliation. Part of it was I felt that the last administration did a lot of things that were actually detrimental to the country and detrimental to our partners overseas. And I have a family member, a daughter who lives in Israel, and so that's a very an ally that I feel very, very strongly about and about supporting. And the last administration did a lot to undermine, and there's a lot of stuff that's come out, formal documentation of programs that undermined our alliance with Israel in the Middle East. And I think the Middle East has been a hotbed for a very, very, very long time, and with the goal of trying to normalize relations and actually try to create a safe environment for everybody in the Middle East, not just Israel, everybody in the Middle East. I feel like the last administration did a lot to undermine that. And I felt that the potential incoming candidate was going to continue those programs, and something I felt strongly about. So I switched my party affiliation because I believe that for a whole bunch
by that you mean Vice President Harris. You assume that that's what she was going to do. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you this
as an extension. Yeah.
I'll tell you that she never posted she never talked about a program of any kind of original thought on any subject. So the assumption was she was going to continue the same as the past administration. So for me, I felt on a financial basis, as financial advisors too, I feel that, if you look at the direction that the country has been moving in on a financial basis, that global security, if you will, it's a lot of our global currencies are based on the U.S. dollar and the U.S. Fed, on so many things that was faltering. In fact, and again, that's not just supposition. There are countries that have aligned themselves to replace the U.S. dollar as a global currency. The way that the spending in this country had been going, there was no way to stop that. You almost have to break the system in order to reset it. And I have multiple reasons why I changed my party affiliation, and those are two: financial and support for what's happening in the Middle East. So that's actually the reasons why
for me, I should let it be known that what allowed me to be, well, two things. One, what it taught me, because I was so against what I know Donald Trump to stand for. And personally, it strikes me as someone that doesn't stand for anything but himself. There's a tendency to, you voted for him? Okay, there's nothing for us to talk about, and I'm not even curious. I don't care. There's just no way. But if I am to be who I strive to be, and not naive, not Pollyanna, but if I talk about questions are more powerful than statements, we need to be more childlike and less childish, then there's something to be said for the immeasurable value in asking, okay, so why did you vote that way? Because we're not a monolith as human beings, and one person's answer is not the same as somebody else's. And when you mention Israel, one thing I thought of is, look, even if I was of the belief that Israel is not in better hands with him in office, I don't have a daughter in Israel. If you believe that Israel is in better hands with him in office, and she's safer there as as well. That's a personal level that I can't even I can't get into those shoes unless I have a daughter, get in a time machine, she becomes an adult, and she goes over there to live and becomes a citizen. So I don't know. So that, as far as I'm concerned, for lack of a better term, trumps any lack of empathy. And then again, if, I didn't think it'd be a difficult question to ask you, but it was, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. I was like, well, I think now that I'm thinking about it, I think maybe it's because the answer was going to be something that made me realize that we don't have as much in common as I thought, and that would be like so shell shocking. So there's several things to be thought of, which is have empathy, ask people questions, try and learn and understand where they come from, because understanding does not mean that you agree. And if you arrive at the conclusion that based on those things that you're not going to have a relationship with that person anymore, I guess so be it. But at least it's not a knee-jerk reaction, because you can end a relationship based on answers to questions that were never asked. And that's not something you want to do, because tomorrow is a handful of things, but a promise is not one of them. And so, when we thought about having this discussion, we thought, I brought it up, and Brian's first thought was, okay, let's talk about this. And our thought was we would have a panel of people on that we know in various professional capacities that are pro-Trump and pro-Bill, or the opposite, so that we'd have an even panel. And we also thought that could be kind of volatile. We don't necessarily know. And then Brian brought up a good point, and I haven't told you this before. Transparency. Brian said, "Well, it's being proposed, as a bill. It hasn't passed yet, so there's a whole lot of, you know, misinformation out there. In addition to it not yet coming to pass." And my thought was that maybe you were even subconsciously looking to justify your choice for vote or whatever have you. When the truth of the matter is, because I didn't think you were consciously doing that, but the truth of the matter is, the manner in which Donald Trump delivers things makes them difficult to accept and or receive, just because of his nature, and everything. So I think sometimes he could be delivering, if he was delivering the most valuable information, the first tendency by many is going to be like, I don't care what he has to say. And the truth, and so what happens is, it gets very easy for there to be misinformation about what he may be saying, simply because he's the messenger, in addition to some of the out there stuff that he may say. But at the end of the day, and I thank you for this, because your thought was, it hasn't passed yet. We don't know if this is going to be that bad. My thought was, I would have been very shocked if it didn't pass, because of the support that, the numbers in the House and everything. But then, to your credit, once it passed, and I said we should talk about it, I said we should talk about it, and I don't think we need any guests, because we're members of the community, and we're going to have a frank discussion about how people get past changes in ideology or whatever have you, because we think that that extends beyond the special needs community. And to your credit, right away you said, you know what, I agree, especially now that it's no longer speculation. We should go ahead and we should have that conversation. And so there are a handful of artificial intelligence platforms and apps and sites out there. And one in particular that we like, which Brian actually discovered, we're not getting paid for this, but we want to share where we got our information from. So we've done two things. We've compiled some information as to exactly how the bill affects our community, those with special needs and those who are caregivers and those with disabilities, as well as who it benefits. And with the various sites that are out there, one that we found that we like is called Manus. And the reason for it is because when you give it a task, it will let you know once the task is complete, and it will also give its sources. In a world where everyone is a public figure, everyone is has access to information, it's good to know exactly what it is that you're looking at. So let's kind of jump right into that.
Let me before we jump before that, I'm going to put it up on the screen here. It's manus.ai, by the way, manus.ai. That's Manus. It's an artificial intelligence. It's a large language model. It's one of those that you can actually ask it to do a deep dive, and it does an extensive amount of research. Before we get into that, though, Shawn, I'm just going to go back to a couple things that you said, because you've made so you're a little guilty of the same issue that a lot of people have, which is the assumption that because you vote for a particular person, that you actually like that person, that you believe everything that person says, that you become a sycophant for that person. I actually worked in Washington, D.C. as an intern back in 1986, and I worked for a congressman from Massachusetts. And my favorite elected official in those days was Joe Biden. I respected the man who took a train ride home on regular fare every single night to Delaware, put his kids to bed after he suffered terrible family tragedy. And I appreciated a lot of who Joe Biden represented when I was again, as an intern and looking at the elected officials in those days. And for many, many years, I was a huge fan of Joe Biden. So I like the man. I am a huge fan of Joe Biden, the man. I think that the treatment of him in the last year or two of his presidency was unfair. And I liked him. I did not like a lot of his policies. To the same tune, I do not like the way that our current president delivers information. I think and I'm going to make a comment here. I think he's a petulant child. I think he's a bully.
I didn't want to say that for you, which is why I didn't go there.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm telling you that I don't agree with how he runs business. I don't agree with the bully tactics. That being said, I understand the theory behind the initiatives that he has proposed, right? And we can talk about Project 2025, which I think was a project written by an extremist group here in the United States that doesn't represent the general population.
Whose author just passed away, by the way.
Without saying anything, that's perfect, actually. But anyways, I don't care for his tactics. I don't care for who he is as an individual, but I do understand the administration's perspective on again trying to right the ship here and change a lot of the change the direction that administration and that. By the way, first time, right? The majority of the population voted for. So it's not a slight group of people that have felt that a change was necessary. There
are those that will debate that, though. I don't know. In terms of,
what do you mean? Debate which part?
How many people voted for him? I guess I should say how genuine the count is. I have no idea which one it is. There are people that are challenging that.
All right, so every election can be challenged, and every election
completely,
right?
Completely. And so I would be the first to say that my instinct to be put it this way: I want to strike a balance between hearing what people say, because there's a whole thing. Well, Elon had this voting machines, rigged or whatever have you. There's put it this way: there's what I wouldn't necessarily put past him, and then there's complete propaganda that's easy to stir up just because he doesn't seem like as much you put past him. The difference between that and truth, who knows?
By using the same standard we have used for every election, the popular vote voted for the current administration. There was no different standard, same standard that was used for the last election and the election before that and the election before that. I mean, we're using this country is perfectly imperfect, right? Everything that we've put in place is not perfect. Perfection is the enemy of great, right? It's still great. We use the electoral college. I have issues with the electoral college. A lot of people have issues with the electoral college, the way it's done. Unfortunately, it is the way it is, and this is the way it's been done for 250 years. So,
and it's a kind of a topic for another show and maybe a part two. But I think part of the problem with our country, which goes back to this whole thing, is people will stand up and, in some ways truthful and in some ways artificially and just on autopilot, talk about why they love the country. And if you talk about things that you don't love about our country, then you're not a patriot. And that is like just the biggest thing of our entire our whole problem and division, which is that love for the country is why the problems need to be discussed. And it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to agree. That's going back to the beauty and the ugliness of our history too. And where we haven't gotten to a point where we can have a good conversation about that. That's why relationships being challenged and that challenge being met with empathy, it's not a very common thing. And it's very, very, very important. It's critical to our survival.
Sure. For sure. Listen, again, I'll go back to 1986 when I was in Washington, D.C. for a summer. I watched elected officials argue on the floor of the House and the Senate and have angry, adamant, convicted stances about things, and then have dinner with their colleagues from the other side of the aisle, have drinks with them in a very cordial way. That was the way it had always been up until about 20 some years ago. It's always been in Washington, D.C., where the idea was to, if you have positions on both sides and you can come to a compromise where both feel that they've both lost and they both won, then you've got consensus. And that was the way it always was until, again, about 20 years ago, when it started to become very of personal attacks and very divisive. And we have a couple of things, honestly, Shawn. We have a few things. We say we have two parties in this country, but we really have four. If you actually look at the extremists on both ends of the party, because I think that you would even say, and something that I felt all along, the progressive faction of the Democratic Party didn't represent my views as a Democrat, nor do the extreme MAGA positions of Project 2025 represent my views on the Republican side either. So those extreme positions had always been kept to a small number. They become very vocal in the last 20 years, and they have infiltrated the two-party system to some degree. And those two are so diametrically opposed. The patriots on the Republican side and the progressives on the Democratic side, those have created, I think, more divisiveness than anything else. And so if you could take those two extremes out of the conversation, I think you'd find that there's much more common ground between the rest. If you looked at it like a bell curve, right? The other 80% of the country, even though we may be 40-40, there's more in alignment, as you talk about all the time. There's more in common and more alignment than there is disagreement. And even if there's disagreement, it's close enough that you go, you know what, we agree to disagree, but I understand your point. I get it. Let's move forward. And so that's, I think, been coloring the conversation lately. And with social media, both of those extremes now have a platform that goes viral and worldwide, and is infiltrated by parties outside of the United States, infiltrated by parties whose goal is to create as much divisiveness here in the United States as possible. And I think, frankly, if we realize that there are more enemies outside than there are inside, that we should actually be aligned to fight off those folks as opposed to fighting each other. But it makes a lot of other countries happy to see us have as much infighting as we have had over the last 20 years. I think that's part of the problem. So anyways, I'll have to say that my vote, every person's vote is a personal vote, by the way, just to reiterate that. Of course, I have a personal vote. I have a personal reason why I voted the way I did. And I do believe that country is in better hands with this current administration. That's a personal opinion. People can argue with it, but their arguments don't mean anything to me because it's a personal opinion.
And for me,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to say, for me, that's where I kind of stopped, because that was enough for me to give as much empathy as possible. Not that I couldn't before, but I was trying to, like, what is it that we do? Like, here's my thing, to be honest. Brian is a kind person, cares about other people, believes in empathy. Everything that we talk about, those are the things that we have in common. This man and that administration doesn't seem to convey like any of that. It seems like so diametrically opposed to what I know Brian to be. Like, if I lost my friend because that's not even the person standing before me, and it even maybe like, I guess hurt is the word, maybe like a little bit. I'm like, but who are you to hurt? That's his choice. But still, like, do we not know each other? And then when I thought for myself, and I think I think this might be the first time I asked you directly. I think we talked about it, but I don't know if I asked directly before. And part of the reason for that was because when I thought about your daughter being in Israel, that's why I said, you know what? I don't have to understand or agree with that, because quite frankly, I didn't know whether or not that was, I didn't have an opinion as to whether or not that was true. I didn't feel informed enough about the situation in the Middle East to know, to form an opinion as to whether or not she and or Israel is safer with Donald Trump in office. But what I did understand was that if you felt that way and you have a daughter living there and I don't, those are shoes that I can't even get into unless I have a child. And I said, like, unless I have a daughter, go to the future and have her there. And I think, and I don't like to say, I made a post the other day when I said we should think twice about accepting anybody calling ourselves experts or taking anything advice from someone who says that they're an expert. Why? Because an expert knows everything they need to know, and they're not going to learn anything. And as long as so I don't like to say, here's what I did, you should do that too. But I think there's some value in fighting for empathy. And at the very least, when you have a situation like that, that you're not going to be able to relate to, that should be a benchmark that tells you a little something.
Yeah, no, listen, I agree. It's amazing to me how many opinions are out there about the current situation in the Middle East by people who've never been, never experienced it, never been immersed in it, never had a personal connection. The thing about media and social media and just people in general is everybody can have an opinion about everything. Nobody says anything.
Everyone is media now.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And my retort generally to people who have a very adamant perspective on Israel and what's happening in the Middle East is, my first question is always, have you been there? Have you ever been to, I don't care when it was, have you ever been there? Because I will tell you, conversations like genocide and apartheid, and I know that's not the subject of today's conversation, but it is all hyperbole. It doesn't exist. If you go, and I had the fortunate pleasure of actually going in early February, right after the election, in early February, going to Israel and spending 2 weeks up and down the country. And I will tell you from my experience, I feel, as back to what you said, I feel very confident that that country is incredibly safe and safer than a lot of our own cities in this United States.
You know what I like about what you just said? I'm not in a position to agree or disagree because I haven't been there, but I've seen people there, out of there. I've seen, and this is where I tell you, and maybe I don't know if I owe you an apology, but at least an explanation. Because when I see something that is wrong, I will stand up as loudly as I can to speak against it. I have not spoken loudly against the activities taking place there, other than to say that, the taking of innocent lives on either side is just completely wrong. And that if someone says free Palestine, that shouldn't necessarily mean, we shouldn't assume that they mean death to everyone in Israel, although there's people that feel that way. And what I like about what you said is you've been there, you feel strongly, and you still took the time to say, based on, my opinion. And I think that approach is huge, because for me, as someone that hasn't been there, I've seen Muslim people interviewed on the street saying, I work, I worship, I eat at restaurants, everything is fine. I go about my business doing what I do. Then I've seen other people that have an opposite experience. So therefore it leaves me with the statement that I have, which is like the taking of any innocent life is wrong. But when you get into the details of everything, you're hearing both sides, and it's not an attempt to straddle a fence, But I commend you for that, because once you've been there and you've seen and you have a feeling, you have confirmation of a feeling that you had before going there, it's very easy to say, look, I'm telling you right now, what you see on the news, none of that is real. That's not taking place. I've been there. I know. And to say, based on my experience, just those words alone, that alone is an act of empathy, because you could very easily just say, I'm telling you, it's not true. I've been there. I know. None of it is true. It's just not, and, so thank you for that.
No, listen, again, war sucks. It does. It sucks on both sides. We don't have to get any more into this conversation. I really want us to dig into the bill. The last thing I'll just say is that, well, I can't say it without us getting into it. All I'm going to say is I support what is happening over there, because Israel's the only country that has entered a war purely on defense, never on offense. They've never instigated a war. They've always defended. They're the only country in the world that has won wars, has won territory in wars, and then given it back so they can have peace. No country has ever won a war and given back the land that they conquered, if you will, right? It doesn't happen that way. It's the only military that tells the civilian population, we are targeting this particular area. We're targeting military installations. Evacuate before we hit. No country has ever done that.
Now,
the United States carpet bombed Tokyo in the World War II. The Allies destroyed cities in Germany, obliterated them, and millions of people in that war. Israel doesn't do that. Israel targets military installations. When the enemy buries its military in civilian populations and in hospitals and schools, they are putting their own people at risk, and they love martyrdom. They live for death to become martyrs. We always say, if they would love life as much as they hate Israel, it would be quite peaceful. If everybody dropped their weapons, let me just say this: if Hamas had released the hostages and stopped sending bombs and rockets into Israel, it would be over. But today, I get notifications every time rockets and bombs are sent into Israel. It happens every day, every single day. So, when you're on the defense and your goal is to have peace in the area, and the other side continues to reject peace, to reject every peace offering, and continue to send bombs and at civilians, specifically at civilians, like they do, what is the alternative? What is the option?
The one thing is, you're saying it's hard for you to say that without us getting into it. Here's the reason why we're not going to, and it's not just because it's a cop-out. I know when I speak with confidence and a certain amount of certainty and can state what those feelings are based upon, I continue to, and I have even more to brush up on, I continue to feel more ignorant and less than adequate from a knowledge standpoint to challenge what you've said at every turn. I can cite things where you hear pieces and things that might challenge that. But again, it's like, oh, I heard this, I heard that. I don't have the certainty to do so, but I know that there are people that are going to see and hear this that will probably challenge that, and maybe even you directly. And that's okay. We discussed all of that before doing this. So again, it's a very many layered conversation. Also, here we are 34 minutes into this episode, and we've talked about things that matter and haven't gotten into the bill. So we're going to do that. But the other thing I should say is that generally speaking, right now, one of the most difficult things to do is to strike a balance between sticking your head in the ground like an ostrich and being and chasing every headline and every story and every post that there is. Somewhere in the middle is someone who is informed and emotionally in touch and in control of what's going on. And that's a very difficult place to stay there in the middle. And so, you know, we haven't had this conversation, especially with the passing of the bill and some of the things that have taken place. It's to the point where, like, okay, so we're like, we are the Pollyanna / ostriches in the caregiving special needs community because these things are affecting our community and we're not going to talk about it. It got to a point where it'd be a complete disservice if we did not do so. So that is why we are here today. So
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay. Let's jump right into it. And I'll be transparent. Like you said, you don't know why it's called that. I appreciate you stating what you don't like about the administration or the occupant of the office, because just the name of the bill, if you want to get into just everything, I'm like, you know, if you're great, if you're smart, if you're large in the ways that count, you are. You don't need to tell people that.
You don't need to tell anybody. Totally agree.
Yeah. So, you know, don't try and compensate by calling it the big, beautiful bill. Shut up already. Anyway. So,
before, as a part of this conversation, John, let me just say this too. You know,
please.
We've talked about, and I don't mean just we, I mean in general, talk about the $5,000 hammer and the $10,000 toilet seat that the military spends in their budget. We've talked about, you know, how much money of the United States budget goes to military and defense, and more importantly, how much waste and misuse and abuse there is. There is a lot.
Let me stop you 1 second. I don't know if that's been talked about as much. Matter of fact, that statement you just made, I think, is indicative of what I said before, which is that Donald Trump, unless you're a sycophant, is a horrible messenger. So even if he's touching on something that is true, right, the tendency is to just shut it off until you said to me, well, and I didn't take you to mean that you were validating them crippling and affecting the communities that need aid and assistance the most, and they were the most vulnerable. But just by you even saying to me, kind of, where do we start? Do you know how much we actually do in fact waste? I wasn't thinking about anything that we waste simply because of.
No, I know.
This way, the fact is we have to start someplace, even though he's chosen rotten places to do so in the most vulnerable communities. But nobody, I don't think what you said is true in that most people have talked about. I think some people have talked about, but some people have overlooked the fact that there's any waste at all because of the person who's talking about the plan to address the waste.
Yeah. Well, I'm prior to this administration. Okay. And I can go back to, I can find references where people talk about abuse. And by the way, I don't have to point to things that people are talking about. I will tell you, the Department of Defense has failed an audit, a governmental audit, 8 years in a row. By failing an audit, what that means is that the department has shown fraud, misuse, and abuse of federal funds. The military has failed it 8 years in a row. That's horrible, right, to begin with. So is the Department of Education. The Department of Education has failed the last 3 in a row, the last 3 audits in a row. That shows you, and by the way, independent, nonpartisan audit of every department and agency in place. We talked about this before, you and I, that a lot of what happens in the federal government is, you know, we've got departments and then we've got agencies. and that sometimes that there's redundancy there. And the goal is, again, from a financial and fiscal perspective, how can we, there's only two ways to, as like with anybody's personal finances, there's only two ways to improve your financial condition. Either you increase your income or you decrease your spending. That's the way it is, right? So in the United States, on a federal level, you either, by increasing income, means you increase taxes. Well, nobody wants to raise taxes, right? Or you lower your spending. So the attack is, the administration's issue has been to try to attack the agencies and departments that are abusing, misusing, and fraudulently spending money unnecessarily, and reduce the federal impact and push it down to the states where they can, and do that without raising taxes. Now, some people would say, well, just raise tax on the wealthy, and we've increased our income. That's one. But some business owners and CEOs and the wealthy 1% would say that goes against the economic goals of the country. So rather than do it internally, do it externally. Let's look at what the other countries are doing in relation to our goods, our exports, and our imports. And the tariff idea, as detrimental as it has been to the economy in the short term, and maybe in the long term, we don't know, because we haven't really seen the impact yet of tariffs. But the idea was balance that inequity and get other countries to pay their fair share. Stop overcharging our goods, which make our goods undesirable in other countries because they raise the tariff on our goods going to those countries. And then, and they're going to pay their fair share. If they've got goods coming into our country, we're going to level it out. And other countries are fighting that. The EU is fighting that right now. Mexico and Canada are still fighting that right now. But the reality is we can get it from the inside or we can get it from the outside. So as much as we don't like the message and the way he messaged, that is the underlying goal behind all of these initiatives in these first 6 months, right? Is to increase the income coming in from other countries via tariffs and reduce spending where there's waste. And we've talked about before, and I know we're going to get into Medicare and Medicaid, and that's a huge topic.
That's the first place that's exactly where I want to start. Yeah.
I know that's
because my thought was, go ahead.
Let me just say this. The Department of Education has a $268 billion annual budget, and the majority of their work goes to service financial aid, right? Which doesn't make any sense to me, because financial aid, which is financial, why isn't that handled by the Department of Treasury?
Let me ask you this, and before we jump into Medicaid then.
Yeah.
Do you think it would have made more sense? You just made a very good point as to where the majority of that spending goes. Do you think it would make sense to simply change where the spending goes as opposed to just getting rid of the entity altogether?
But that is the goal. The goal is to have it handled by the department that handles all of that and eliminate those bodies at the agency that are servicing that to reduce that budget. By the way, Shawn, I would think every American should be embarrassed by the fact that our overall education system is now ranked in the 40th or below level compared to other countries. When before the Department of Education was created, we were in the top 5. So our education system hasn't been improved by installing this $268 billion expense. In fact, it's deteriorated, and for what purpose, right? So
let me ask you.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
I'm just gonna say it's the intent of DOGE, and again, how they went about it, I don't agree with, but the intent was, look at where that spending is happening at the federal level, find ways to reduce that spending at the federal level, shift some of the focus to other departments that are suited for it, and in other areas, shift it back to the states where the states can handle that influx.
So the manner in which abolishing it altogether affects, specifically talking about our community, special education, is there not a way to protect and preserve the manner in which special education is affected and benefits without abolishing the Department of Education altogether?
You're You asked about the specifics about the budget that I'm not sure about. I'll give you a theoretical answer to that.
Okay.
We live in California, you and I.
Mm-hmm.
We
Right.
benefit from the state of California's initiatives, right?
Tremendously, yes.
Where do most of the the funding from the state come from for folks with disabilities? Like for education on one side, folks with disabilities in general. I'll answer the question by telling you that most of the ADA and special effort in this state is handled by the state's Department of Health and Human Services.
Mm-hmm.
The education piece is by the Department of Education. So luckily in California, we have a lot in our budget that supports both those departments, both the disabilities, folks with disabilities, and the educational system. So other states are not as fortunate as we are. So do I think that it can be, I don't know specifically how the numbers get moved around because I don't know every state's budgets, but I would say I agree with you. Outright slashing and abolishing entire departments and agencies seems to be extreme. It's beyond, right? Yeah. Again, we have to go back. The intent is not to wipe out people's livelihoods. The intent is to save money and put us back in a better situation fiscally. So again, that's the first place to start because where there's, as we've just talked about, abuse and misuse in the Department of Education and the Department of Defense, I guarantee you, Department of Energy, every department has probably quite a lot of that. And as you just said a second ago about not trusting necessarily the election results, right? There's a lot of that kind of stuff. Like we don't know where it's all happening. We don't know where bloated government exists, right? So in some cases, you have to break it down and break it apart in order to fix it. Because I don't know what the solution is on the voting thing. I don't know how you solve that problem. I don't know how you solve a lot of these issues. I think the government's trying to say, let's put the effort and the focus in the areas where we can focus the help and the support and not create, widespread havoc. We'll talk about Medicaid. Let me just say this, Shawn, just for anybody who catching us late in this conversation, Shawn and I are just talking about the impact of this conversation that he and I have had in pieces together over the last 6 months or so, but we haven't done it in this forum. And so we're just talking about the impact of the administration's decisions on a whole bunch of things, but primarily, even though we've gone to other areas, we want to talk about how it impacts our community. And I think, Shawn, I'm okay with us going longer and creating a part 2 right here in this setting without us having to record a second.
Do another, yes, I agree most definitely. And then the other thing is what we're going to do, just so you guys know, is we're going to come back and it will be a separate episode. It may be 20 minutes, but because of our experience working in financial services and serving the community that we belong to and are passionate about, we're also going to come back with some tangible steps, concepts, and ideas that you can take to fortify your own situation, your own financial situation in the midst of change. Because at the end of the day, with everything that we're talking about here, it matters what takes place in the White House. People died for you to have the right to vote, but that does not change the fact that what matters is what takes place in your own house. So for sure, we're going to have another episode where we follow up with that too. So let's jump into go ahead and jump into Medicaid.
Let's just jump into Medicare, Medicaid. What I was starting to say is a lot of the issues at the voting level impact this as well. The reason I'm telling you that, what we've seen is that there's a lot of abuse at people who are voting multiple times, people who have passed away who somehow generate votes. Like there's a lot of abuse and fraud in our election. By the way, I know people who have worked at local, election offices. And the stuff that they tell me that goes on, I'm surprised there's not more of it, honestly. There's not more fraud and more things going wrong. I know people who, let me just say, I know somebody who works at a polling location in a small area in California, and at the end of the voting night, they take the ballot box home. And then they send it, they deliver it that, because usually they're not done till 10, 11, 12 at night. And if you guys have been to a voting location, it's not manned by young people. It's generally an older population who's volunteering their time. They're not going at midnight to some local location in the middle of the city to deliver their ballot. They take it home, and the next day when they wake up, they take it, right? So anything can happen. I'm also going to say that when it comes to Medicare, there's a lot of that's happening as well. So some of the intent to cut some of the Medicare budget is to try to find out if there's abuse, fraud, misuse, all of that. Every agency, every department has this vulnerability now. Open up their kimonos and find out, is the system being abused and misused and fraudulent. That being said, it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Just because there may be that, why are you cutting all of these other services that are really helping underserved and, needy, vulnerable part of our population, right?
Yeah.
And again, I'm not defending them. I'm just going to say that my understanding is that the goal is to push a lot of this down to the states. And again, in California, we have the benefit of having a very progressive state when it comes to this, to this element. And there are some protections in place for California citizens for things like in-home services and other things, because there was an act passed in 1969 that made sure that folks with disabilities are a protected class. You're against, their discrimination. They are protected from discrimination. So, I would say that most people in other states have to use the power of the vote to implement the kinds of things that we have here, that we benefit here.
And not to get off on a tangent, but I was on a call with, as you know, I served as a 2024 fellow with Caring Across Generations, and I was on a Zoom call with a group of former fellows and the founder of Caring Across Generations, and one of the people that was on the call was in, I believe, Alabama. And they talked about several things, how these changes there are care deserts, so to speak. So you have someone that lives in a rural situation where care is not available for 50 to 100 miles. And as a result of these cuts, that's being wiped out. What are those people supposed to do? And then talking about appreciating what you have, those of us that are in California, there was one person who, they were in the South, I don't remember where, but the way that state operates, if the spouse becomes ill and needs full-time care, the healthy spouse is not able to be paid for caring for that person. However, another family member is. So if you don't have children, or in a situation like that, you're forced to choose between work and providing care. So the other thing that happens is, I think that there's this stigma because of what you mentioned, people that take advantage of and or game the system. People do that. If you give something to someone that they don't have to work for, good people accept that gingerly. And we talk about, that's just a whole nother conversation. But from a culture standpoint, there are people that just don't accept anything like that because they're too proud. And those are people that get harmed as well, because it's people that take advantage of that and will take as much as they possibly can. And what happens is there's a stigma that anyone that's receiving any of those services is an opportunist and or a lazy person. And that's just not true. That goes back to empathy and treating people, on a case-by-case basis, looking at what's in front of you. But when you consider that nearly 1 in 5 Americans age 50 to 64 get their health insurance through Medicaid, that's huge. And that's not speculation in terms of who's going to be affected by this bill. That
Yeah.
That part is real, and some of the squeeze and the pain has already begun in certain communities.
Yeah. Well, and again, we didn't talk about this prior to the bills passing, only because they were just, most of the things were proposals, and until it's signed, it doesn't mean anything. And by the way, I will also say, after it's signed, I'm not going to say it doesn't mean anything, because obviously, as you just stated, some people are already being impacted by it. But there's always challenges to bills that have passed in the court system, in individual cases, in most cases, until it escalates to the up through the court system. There's still a lot to be done, and I think that the more vocal we are as a community, the better chance we're going to have of having some of it either restored or protected, or something to occur. What generally can happen is that people will take a position and they'll go, oh well, I guess that's it, we're done, we're screwed, and then they accept what they're given, as opposed to fighting. Go ahead.
I'm glad you mentioned that. At the end of that call, and I'll be sharing it here and on our social media as well. There's going to be, I'll pull the information. There's going to be I believe it's more than 24 to 48 hours, constant virtual vigil to step up and speak out against these changes that are taking place. Because the other thing that's real is, okay, you have these slashes and these cuts, but then they're imposing these changes where it's like you need to work a ridiculous amount of hours in order to get any of it as well. That's like telling somebody, which one of your children's lives do you want to save? I need to shoot one of them. Pick. Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense at all. But we're going to be sharing that information also. Matter of fact, I'll pull that up. Go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, why don't we do this, Shawn? Let's do a little wrap on this first half, and then we'll play the banners and everything, and then we're gonna do a part two to finish conversation, so people are not necessarily stuck in a long loop here. So this is sort of part one of a conversation of the impact of legislative acts that have been passed, that are being discussed, that are being volleyed around, and the impact that those programs have on our community. We're going to continue this conversation in part two of our Just Two Dads podcast. So if you participated, by the way, if you listened, thank you for listening. Anybody who's on any podcast outlet or catching us on our YouTube channel, on our website, if you have any comments that you'd like to send to us directly, we are just2dads@gmail.com. Our email address, we are just2dads@gmail.com. Put comments on the Facebook page or on the YouTube channel. We welcome all comments, and be respectful. I would say it's sad that we have to actually say that now, but such vitriolic conversations that occur. If you have an issue with either of our positions, we don't have an issue with that, as long as it's a respectful conversation. We're trying to have a respectful conversation. Shawn and I truly love each other, and respect one another. And so because of our friendship, we can have this dialogue and have a disagreement about how stuff happens and still be respectful to one another and appreciate and love the other's perspective. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the true American way. So hopefully you will engage in that respectful discourse with us. You want to say anything, Shawn, before we put a wrap on this, and then we'll come back for a second half?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I belong to several support groups on social media. We have a group of our own, which is a men's support group called The Den, a support group for fathers and caregivers of those with special needs or disabilities. One of the groups that I belong to, a mom whose son was went to school with my son Elijah. She started this group, and there was a post that I saw. There's a guy who is, I don't believe he's a doctor, I think he's a health guru, and he was in an interview, and there's a clip where he talked about the benefits of nicotine patches, not only helping with autism but curing it. And as wacky as that sound, I had the same reaction.
Wow.
I posted it on my page on Facebook. Yes, I'm still on Facebook as well. And I posted it and said, has anybody ever heard of this? This is crazy. I did that in the group as well. And when I tell this story, anyone I'm telling it to says, yeah, you're asking like, this is wacky. Has anybody ever heard? I got one response that said, how about you do your research before posting things like this?
Wow.
And I was like, and I didn't think much of anything of it. A couple weeks later, keeping in line with the same type of conversation we're having here, looking at the actions, statements, and history of RFK Jr., I made a post on my page and I said, if there's the one thing that the appointment of RFK Jr. has taught me with the civil war within our special needs community right now, is that empathy is really needed. What I've learned is if your child has autism that is severe, there's a greater chance that you're going to see him as a savior and support what he's doing. If not, you're going to tend to question it. And at this point, we don't need to agree. We don't know each other's situation, and we need to respect a person's freedom to feel as they do, even if we don't agree with it, whatever it might be. And I posted it in that group as well. And there was such an uproar of people that came after me as well as people that defended me. And there was one person that said, this is the second senseless post that he's made. If that's what this group is about, I'm going to leave. And the mother, to her credit, who started the group said, hey, if that's what you need to do whatever it is that you got to do. This is an open forum. There's a question that's asked. And I even explained, I don't agree. I don't know what his qualifications are. And I question them. I question his ability to do what he's doing, regardless of the intent, which is to get to the quote unquote cure and cause of autism. But it served as an example of how, anything that affects the general population affects our community 10 times more so. We get into this thing where like, you're not advocating the right way. You're not doing this the right way. And we need to do away with that and just, real empathy. That's the other thing too. People don't realize empathy at its truest core and its highest value takes work. I had a conversation with my brother once where I said that, and he was like, "No, I don't agree." I said, "No, I think you do." It doesn't take work to not be a jackass, but anybody can not be a jerk to someone. But to actually get curious about somebody's shoes that they're walking in, there's a difference between what's wrong with that guy? Why is he doing that? As opposed to, I wonder why he's doing that.
No.
So again, this is never enough. We'll see you in a minute in part 2.
We'll come back for second part of Just Two Dads. Thanks for watching us, and see you soon.